Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. I am joined, as always, by Maggie Parke, as always, in another exciting new location. So there we are in the bright, sunny attic this afternoon. Maggie is.
I do feel like I need a little where in the world is Maggie? But it's not anywhere exotic. It's in my sister's attic office. So my
Yes.
very patient brother-in-law is next to me, so I'll try to keep it down for the first few minutes while he finishes work.
Yes, though, of course, in the sunshine, because you are
I know,
here
in
in America.
daytime.
Yeah.
I'm here for the summer gang, so 4:30 in the afternoon instead of 9:30 at night. At least we know we won't be woken by Hazel and her nightmares. So
That's right.
that's
That's
something.
right.
Or interrupted.
We possibly should have waited to talk about orcs and bad guys until you were in the sunshine, but that's all right.
That's all right. Nice to be back. And we had a break for Myth Moot. You had a nice week at Myth Moot.
We had a great week at Myth Moot. Yeah, Myth Moot was really fun as always. Had a good time we were talking about studio stuff down there, and had some fun conversations. Lots of people excited about what's going on here. But anyway, so today we wanted to talk about. So we want to come back really sort of to a question that we've started asking before. It's been something that's I've been thinking about a lot, and it was the conversation when we talked about Star Wars Visions, and we were talking specifically about we chose as an illustration the I Am Your Mother of Star Wars Visions, the one made by the Wallace and Gromit folks, and the question that I found most intriguing as we were thinking about that then, as we were thinking about Star Wars Visions as a kind of an example, right? As a really interesting sort of envelope pushing example, really, for adaptation and understanding and defining adaptation, really. And the question basically is, how do you know? So we spent a lot of time talking about things like, okay, so when you're adapting a source text, what is the relationship with the source text? And we've been trying to talk about ways in which it's obviously a little more complicated than just have they made changes from the source text. There's a lot of that ground we've gone over a good deal, but this seems to me a much more advanced kind of question. When you take something like Star Wars Visions, which is, here's a short story that may involve planets, races, and plot lines that have nothing to do with any Star Wars story ever published. So there are continuity issues, right? There are basic sort of world continuity issues that may come into play, but it's plot-wise totally disconnected from everything.
So Phil, to your point,
yeah.
So to Phil's point in the chat, don't worry, for us talking about Star Wars today, if you haven't seen Visions or anything else, we're just talking about that as kind of a vehicle, because Visions is totally separate from
That's exactly
any
the point.
Storyline we know. That's the purpose of it.
Yeah, exactly. So the question that I was really wrestling with that day was, how do you even answer the question of does it fit? When you're trying to figure, does this work? Is this right? Does this succeed as a Star Wars adaptation? How do you base that answer? What do you base that answer on? And we were talking about things like how Star Warsy is it? Does it succeed?
And what makes it Star Warsy?
Yeah, on what is Star Warsiness based? So I wanted to come back to this question, both because I've watched all of both seasons of Vision since then, and I couldn't help but think about this question again and again as I was going through the entire 2 seasons of Star Wars Visions. But also, there are other really interesting kinds of places where this sort of comes into question, and that is with adaptations where there's no clear source text, right? One that you a project that you mentioned, Maggie, as we were thinking about today, was the Barbie movie, right? Mm-hmm. The Barbie movie, on the one hand, clearly an adaptation. On one level, an adaptation, right?
Based on something else,
right?
Yeah.
In other words, people coming to the Barbie film are in some sense going to have this, they're going to be asking this kind of evaluative question, right? What does success look like for that adaptation, right? And the thing that it made me think of, Maggie, was the Lego film. You know, thinking of the original Lego movie from several years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was in a similar kind of position. Like, what does that mean? That it's a
Yeah.
movie about Lego, right? Like,
And I'm
precisely.
and I'm so glad you made that like comparison, because when I'm thinking about the Barbie movie coming out, we don't know what it is yet. I haven't seen it, but if you watch the trailer, it's quite tongue in cheek. It feels very adult.
Right,
So we're taking two starting points, children's toys,
right,
and going in very different directions. But the audience doesn't necessarily know that. So if you just know it's based on a toy, you have so many varying expectations coming into that film. You know, you
right,
think it's a kid's film, you think it's, you know, this storyline because it says Batman, but it's really, really not, you know.
right, right, right.
So yeah, that's what I was interested in, of like the expectations of these different platforms coming into it. So
Yeah.
Visions, I feel like, was a really good vehicle for us to start that conversation, because each episode is almost a different medium. They're all animated, but they're incredibly different. They don't tie together, and yet
Yes.
somehow they all work too. And yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then there's two other films that I would point to, which are on different kind of points of the spectrum, right? Would be the Super Mario film on the one
Which
hand.
I haven't seen yet, but so want
Right.
to.
I haven't seen it yet either. But again, just sort of conceptually, again, my question is not to review it, but to ask the question: what does it mean
What
for it
makes
to be successful as an adaptation? Like, what does that look like?
Right.
And then the Dungeons and Dragons movie, which I did talk about on that week that you couldn't be here. And I would say that when I say further down the spectrum that I'm thinking there, Super Mario. Now, over the years, with all of the sequel games and the ways in which that's been developed, the Super Mario world has been developed through console games and that kind of thing. There is a great deal more sort of narrative and world building that has gone into the Super Mario world, certainly than those of us who grew up playing it, on the old, Nintendo Entertainment System would associate with it. But still, it's compared to, an adaptation of a novel, it's really, really light as far as like story and characterization, like, people coming in and comparing it to the source text, right? I mean, I don't think that people, you just can't have the same expectations for a Super Mario adaptation that you would have for like an adaptation of War and Peace, right? I mean, like, it's just
No.
not going to be the same, right? But I think that the Dungeons and Dragons movie, although it's similar in the sense that it's an adaptation not of a story, but of a game system, right? A gaming system. But I think it's further towards like the novel end because there is more story. There is very much explicit world building that goes into the D&D gaming system, and so there are certainly way more things. If people who are going to come in with checklists, which we generally discourage people coming into adaptations with checklists, but
And yet
if
we
you're
keep
gonna,
bringing it up.
yeah, even if you're going to do it, it's much it's easier to have a much longer one with the D&D film than with the Super Mario film, right? Anyway, like that's the
And with
yeah. Go ahead.
this, we just get so excited. That's all it is.
It's okay.
But,
Yeah.
and with both of these two, I mean, I'm just thinking about video games now. Like you have such varying audiences for video games. Like I would not expect the audience for Super Mario Brothers to be the same as the audience for Dungeons and Dragons. And as a filmmaker, I would want to consider that. So when I would engage with development, you've got a lot more space with Mario Brothers because there's not a lot to work with there, bare bones. It's quite simplistic, like here's your stereotype, here's your world, go. Whereas Dungeons and Dragons and the people playing it, much more invested, much more time, much more autonomy, very engaged. So the bar is a bit higher there because there's a lot more personal audience buy-in. They are participating in the story. They are identifying with characters. I don't identify with Mario. I just play Mario,
Right.
So the people coming to watch Mario are there to be entertained. The people coming to watch Dungeons and Dragons, I feel like might be a little bit more threatened because you're in their world. So when you're talking about success, you kind of have to weigh what that audience is expecting as success as well. For entertainment, sure, easy enough to attain for satisfaction and putting their torches and pitchforks away. A little bit trickier with the Dungeons and Dragons crew.
Right. Right. Yeah, I agree. JJ has a really interesting parallel here. He says, thinking just of Nintendo properties, right? For a Super Mario movie, he says we'd expect a simpler, more lighthearted story. Just if you play the game, that's what you would come in, probably what you would come in expecting. Whereas if somebody were doing a film adaptation of The Legend of Zelda, which could well happen, right? You'd expect a more world building, a more, as he says, a more lore heavy story, right? Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. And some of those elements, I think, are part of what it would mean to be. I mean, again, one of the fundamental questions that we have been going about trying to answer for over a year now has been the question of, like, what does it mean for an adaptation to be true to the original? Like, what kind, when you're trying to figure out how to talk about that, how do you talk about that? And this stuff, it's really fun to think of these. I'm tempted to call it, this might sound like a slight, and I don't mean it as a slight, but these kind of fringe examples, right? Fringe in the sense of like when you've got a famous book and you're doing a film adaptation of that famous book. That's like the mainstream of what everybody thinks of when you think about adaptation issues and this question of, truth to the original and purism and all of those things, right? Whereas these other things, I mean, again, like, the Lego movie was really good, but even if the Lego movie had been bad, was anybody going to go to this and be like, this is untrue to the Lego toys I know? Like, I'm not, I mean, like, and it's hard to see people up in arms in exactly the same way. That's what I mean. That's sort of more fringe, kind of in that way. Now, another example, which is along similar lines, it's not exactly the same situation, but the same questions kind of spill over towards it, is the new Indiana Jones film, right? And there, that question of, how do you evaluate that, right? Do you evaluate it as an Indiana Jones movie, right? Yeah.
And I think that's a tough one to kind of talk about too, because it's not strictly an adaptation, right? Like, right. We're not talking about book to film, but we're talking about a series that is 30, almost 40 years old. So that is an adaptation when you think about reimagination. You're taking something known and you're interpreting it in a new way. Same characters 40 years on, it is kind of a retelling. So I think it's fair for us to bring that into this space because we are talking about like a reboot, Yeah. And I know they tried it with Kingdom of Crystal Skull not too long ago, but we don't need to talk about that one.
Yeah, that was pretty horrible, though. I mean, I feel like we almost have to talk about that because it's a good example of
failure not working. Yeah,
absolutely.
Not ticking the box correctly.
No. And I mean, at the end of the day, of course, it goes back to one of the things I've been saying about adaptations for years, is that when you're making an adaptation, your first responsibility is to make a great movie. And they failed at that, just like the Hobbit films failed at that also. And so much of the rest of it becomes moot. As is so often the case, I find, with the Hobbit films. Like, many of their actual adaptation choices are really good and really interesting, but it doesn't matter because the films are so bad.
That's so often the case with That's so often the case with sequels too, isn't it? There's just this hype to live up to the first film that all they think about is reenacting a first film instead of just telling a good story.
Yeah.
Frozen 2 is the one that comes to mind when I think about that. I wouldn't like Frozen 2 unless I watched the making of documentary. That just makes me like the process. The actual film has some serious story problems.
Right.
So they're just trying to capitalize off success of Frozen, but you can't do that without a functioning story.
Yeah, no, I really do think that the question of, I mean, this with Indiana Jones, it's essentially in the Star Wars situation, right? As far as, when we talked about Star Wars as an adaptation project, it's not exactly an adaptation. There isn't a source text exactly, but especially things like, everything they've been doing with Star Wars other than the prequels from the animated, from the Clone Wars and Rebels and the Bad Batch to the Mandalorian and Andor and Rogue One and the Solo film. All of these things have all been fill in the gaps adaptations, right? Mm-hmm. But of course, in a sense, then you can say, well, what is a sequel? But filling in the future gap,
after.
right?
Right.
So really, I mean, this process, there is a fundamental harmony between the process of making a good adaptation of something and making a good sequel of something.
Yeah.
There is they are at the very least first cousins, if not like really the very very similar process.
Yeah, exactly. Like in terms of production and development, it is a really similar process. You have a core thing that you're trying to replicate, but instead of being 300 pages of text, you have 90 minutes of film time, screen time.
Right. And there's, one of the things I think theoretically that makes the sequel making thing most different from the adaptation thing is that there is the pressure that it has to be different, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, like any adaptation, like book to film, is gonna be different, right? But there's no pressure to come up with a new story. Like, if anything, the pressure's all in the other direction, like to be as close to the original as possible. Whereas when you're making a sequel to a successful film, hopefully a successful film, you have a lot of those same, like, there's got to be continuity. We're thinking about the relationship. We want these to be really closely related, like an adaptation in its source. But now, instead of saying we're trying to stay as close to the original as possible, you're saying it has to be different. If we just rehash the same thing, that's what so many people were complaining about with The Force Awakens, for instance, that was just a rehash of the first trilogy, especially of A New Hope. And even to the point where now, I mean, I liked the fact that the characters themselves were like conscious of this, right? Yeah. I mean, like it was worked into like Han Solo's remark that there's always a way to blow up these things, right? I mean, there was
tongue in cheek.
Yeah, I mean, those elements I actually quite liked about The Force Awakens, but it's not that I didn't see the problem, right? And it seemed to me to go. To go that they were walking that line imperfectly, right? In that sequel, but yeah, that seems to me the biggest, as far as I can see, the biggest difference between doing an adaptation and doing a sequel is that pressure for difference.
Yeah, I think that pressure is really interesting to think about, though. I know I've mentioned the Harry Potters before, but that's my clearest example of the first two Harry Potters are so faithful to the text that they're really boring films.
Yes.
And then they knew they had an audience because people came to see it. They made bank. They had millions. They knew people were going to keep seeing this franchise because they were successful financially with the audience. So then they had freedom. So the third film takes a real departure from the text, visually, textually, character development, costume, music, everything. And it's real different. And then it kind of follows that track for the rest of the series. So, you do have that pressure to satisfy book fans initially, author themselves, the expectation to not mess with that. But then once you've secured that, you get a little bit more freedom. Yes. And what you do with that, The one that always baffles me, though, I worked with a couple of producers that had the rights to a text and sent me a draft of the script. And I hadn't read the book for two of these is what I'm thinking of. I hadn't read the book yet, but they noted, oh, we want to change the end. We want to do this instead. It makes for a better story. I was like, ooh, because they want to change the end. And one of them was this kid's book about somebody dying of cancer, and they wanted the person to die at the end and not live. And I was like, that is a huge change. Like,
it's a pretty big change.
If you want to change that, and this is a multi-million copy selling book, like, what's your plan? Because you got to manage that expectation. So that kind of change just for shock value or because you think it's a better story, that feels reckless to me. Like, you got to know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
But if people have ideas,
the change they wanted to make was they wanted to kill the character.
They wanted to kill the character
instead of wow.
Yeah.
So it was a survival story, and they wanted to. Oh,
man. It was a survival story, And it was a teenage thing, you know, like,
Right.
yeah, they wanted to kill the
Wow.
lead kid.
Wow.
I was like, well, then
Wow.
you're really not getting a sequel. You're going to bond on multiple fronts.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that was
Wow.
intense.
Wow.
It never got made. That one has not been made.
Yeah. 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 And so,
Sorry, I got distracted. I'm like,
no,
yeah,
but see,
that was entertaining.
but it's actually an interesting kind of example, right?
Yeah.
I think back, Phil refers to Tolkien's reference to an adaptation needing to not change the core of the original, right? The question is, what is the core?
What's the core?
How do you define that exactly?
And that makes me think of our Christmas Carol conversation, because I loved that realization. You made me wake up on that one, to be like, the core of Christmas Carol is seeing that other options.
Change. Yeah. The change. Yeah. The change of heart, and that change of heart is possible, whether or not it happens.
If that core can be 1 second, that core can be a moment, but as long as that core is there, that was a very cool discovery.
It was, and that's why your example, the cancer example, there strikes me as as a perfect example. I mean, it's not just an alteration to kill the character at the end instead of the character. I mean, when you take a story of survival and you turn it into a story of grief, that's a totally different story. And a story of grief, that's a story worthy of being told. Like, it's
absolutely.
I can understand. I mean, I guess I can understand somebody who reads the book and says, I would rather this were a different story than the story that it is, right? But in a situation like that, like, you can't do that.
Sure.
Like, because it's an ultimate violation, I think, of that core. It would seem to me.
That's when you write fan fiction. Like, if you read something, you're like, oh, I think I can do this better or different. Here's an exercise. You don't actually rewrite the text. Like, I'm sure I've shared this year too, the first version of Twilight. Bella was a track star at Brigham Young University, and Edward was not a vampire. He was a criminal on the run from the FBI. Why even call that Twilight? Like, there's such departures from the text that you really question, do they recognize what a core is, or are they just trying to create something that they think audiences will like and attaching it to a property because they think that will make it more successful?
Which is where, and this, of course, comes straight into the main stuff that you have done with these people. But, like, it's why you think that, I mean, if you want to tell a certain story, right? Again, there's no reason you can tell that story. Like, if they want to tell the story about the track star and the criminal, like, they could make a movie about a track star and a criminal. Like, that's fine.
Why pay millions for the rights and disappoint loads of fans and have that going against you going into it?
And what simply seems complete hubris, essentially, to say, like, okay, we want to make a film from this book because this book has sold tens of millions of copies, right? Because people, obviously, there's something in this story that people are resonating with, and so therefore millions of people have bought copies. That's what led us to want to do this adaptation in the first place, right? Yeah. Now we're going to say,
JK.
We think their story is not in fact a good story at all. A much better story would be a completely different story. Yeah. I get just that sort of rationale. Ooh, talk about striking close to home. Phil's just asking, isn't that what they did to Susan Cooper?
I almost did that example, Phil, because you know I'm going to bring them all up. Susan Cooper was another one. Why on earth take a book that focuses on Arthurian legend and time travel and all of this Celtic myth, take all of that out, and make my 11-year-old British hero a 14-year-old American and give him a love interest and a twin trapped in an alternate dimension? Like, none of this exists in the story, and all of that is fine. You can have that coming of age story, but don't call it The Dark is Rising.
Right.
Yeah. Oof, I can go off on that tangent for a while, gang.
Yeah, but all of this stuff really, I don't know. This is why it's so useful for me to process this on all of these different levels, right? Because this, in some ways, this stuff is all exactly the stuff we've been wrestling with trying to ourselves work through and help people understand better how to talk about exactly these questions. So let's go back to the sort of the fringy stuff, right? I think it's really useful having seen, the sort of the similarities to the basic sort of adaptation question. But let's go back to things like Barbie, right? Or things like the Lego film, right? The thing that to me made the Lego movie such an interesting example of an adaptation of this kind is that there they seem to me to be like the fundamental premise of the movie. Like the movie is about Legos and what it means to build Legos. And there's this, the way that it balances the two different levels on which the story is happening, right? There is like the inner world of the Lego characters and the world that the Lego world in which they're living, right? Mm-hmm. In which like the Craggle is the great threat, right? And all these things. And then there is the frame world outside that, right? Of the boy and his father, and the way that they play with Legos and what that means to them. And that seemed to me to be a fundamentally brilliant way to kind of get at the essence of what Lego means, right? Both of these things, that like it is about, at least, I mean, I always found it to be about like the Legos. When I was a kid, I loved playing with Legos and building Legos because it was like world building, right? And it was like, the kind of imaginative things, man, like all of the, we had a bunch of Castle Lego sets when I was a kid, and my little brothers were kids, and my little brother and I used to have like these epic battles with our like Castle Lego sets and everything, and these like all these stories that we would put into place and stuff, and play out. The way in which Legos are both a vehicle for narrative, right? Mm-hmm. That is independent of you, but also like the story and the bonding of building them together, right? Yeah. Like the process itself, and the way that the film actually captured both of those levels was just gorgeous and really, really brilliant.
And beyond, I mean, that's like level 1 and 2, which are beautiful, both of them. But I also feel like there's another level of just like epic storytelling. I mean, you could absolutely bring Hero Monomyth and things like that into it, because at the core of everything is free will and fate, right? I mean, like, what's his purpose? He wants to fulfill his dream. He wants to be free. He wants to build and grow and be, the fact that you could get that out of a Lego character, there's no reason.
And the way that mapped in such an intricate and complex way between the Lego character and the kid, right? And oh man, it was so well.
And this is what's so fun when you
right?
Yeah. And then what's so fun when you take a story that could be so simple and you put the time and the thought into it, like you could have just made a quick Lego movie. It probably would have made bank. It would have been fun. But no, this is taking like Pixar level storytelling into it. And let's add as many nuances and levels as we can and make it for the grownups and the kids. And every time I watch like a movie, I catch something else. There's so many good jokes. There's so many good cameos and things happening in the background that it's brilliant. I just think it's a great film. So in terms of adaptation, you're taking lots of little stuff and making it play out in a beautiful story. You're taking my expectation and satisfying it, but then raising it and wowing, And I love the idea that you said where like you're actually physically building the world. So I have my own personal time and investment building that castle.
Yes.
And then get to participate in watching this new story unfold. There's a lot of emotional buy-in.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that I was wondering about when I was going to the D&D film. Because I didn't know, I had read almost nothing about it. So I knew very, very little about the film before I showed up to it. I tend to keep myself as my first viewing experience as virginal as possible when it comes to experiencing the thing, and so one of my big questions was to what extent, like, is this just going to be like a fantasy movie that takes place within the world basically the primary world of D&D, or are they going to make any attempt to have like the actual role playing experience enacted into it? And the example that I gave was the old 1980s D&D cartoon, which received a gorgeous cameo shout out in the film, in the recent film. It was really fun. It was one of those beautifully well done things where so like at the end there's like this like big dungeon thing that like a couple groups are competing to go through this like competitive environment, right? Okay. And so the main protagonists are one of the groups that comes into this at the end, and there are these two other groups like of red shirts, right, that are competing against them in there in the end, and one of them is the group from the 1980s cartoon, like all the same characters dressed exactly the same way, and no attention is drawn to it, like no big deal is made of it. But it's like, but if you watch the cartoon, like there were a bunch of people of a certain age in the theater when I was there being like, oh my gosh, look at that. Anyway, that was really fun. But in any case,
example of fan service.
Excellent example of fan service. In that old cartoon though, the whole premise of the cartoon was basically trying to model the role-playing experience. It was the story, that the frame narrative of the cartoon was that there were these like, modern teenagers who somehow get magically transported back into this like fantasy kingdom where they are like, put into the bodies of these like, it's like Jumanji kind of essentially. Yeah. Very much like that kind of premise, except years and years before. Either of the Jumanji films. In other words, so like the sort of the break between like I am this character, but I also am this player from the modern world, right? That was there throughout the sort of the storyline there. And so that was my question. Like the Lego film, right? Like the way in which the Lego film was kind of doing both levels at one time. Were we going to get any of that sort of stuff? And I... not much less certainly than the 80s cartoon did, much less also than the Lego film attempted to do. I think that there were some elements there, and I think in order for it to be, it was an excellent film. I think in order for it to be as excellent an adaptation as the Lego film was, I think it would have needed to do a little bit more of that. There were still some elements, and there were still some kind of parallels there, where you could see, I agree with what Matagot says, that they did a good job of having the story be driven by individual characters' choices and growth in ways, yes, that did feel similar to the way I'm thinking, especially Matagot, I'm forgetting the name, the sorcerer character was one that really struck out in that particular way. But anyway, it comes down to successfully identifying that core, right? Yeah. And so whether you're talking about something like that horrible cancer survivor film that you were talking about, or the Twilight proposal that you were talking about, or The Dark is Rising, which sadly did in fact happen, with those things, these are filmmakers, these are adapters who are completely whiffing on the core,
or grasping,
do not at all see what the core is. And there's a
lot of reasons that could happen.
Sure.
So I don't really feel like we need to dive into that. There's a lot of reasons that could happen, but the core topic is what makes us upset as successful adaptations. And I think successful in terms of reception, we don't need to think box office and things like that, because that's a different definition. But
yes.
That core is what people don't necessarily take the time to discover and how to translate it.
Yeah. I agree that box office doesn't matter so much. Not because we're like, oh, it's not about money, it's about art. But because
I look at the money side all the time. Like that's definitely fun to look
the money
at.
matters.
This is a different conversation.
But it is a different question. I mean, you could take an example. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but a film which is an adaptation, where the film is excellent and the book was much less good. and so you could say it's a bad adaptation in the sense that it missed the core. It changed the core, but it changed the core in a good way. And it is now a good story in ways that the original was not a good story. I think I'm sure there are examples, though many people don't know them because they'll just think of and not even realize that there was a book, right? Mm-hmm. I am tempted to say a controversial thing and put The Princess Bride in this basic category, but that would be a slightly saucy thing to say, and I'm not ready to go all the way down that road. I do think the film is better than the book, but I don't know that I would call the book a failure. That's where I would stop short.
No, both things can be successful and be very different from each other. I think we've talked about that too. There's wonderful stories that have made wonderful films, and they're very different. That's okay. It's just how you tell the story in a different way.
And The Princess Bride is a bad data point from an adaptation perspective because it's the same person. Right, it's not somebody coming in and adapting the work of somebody else. And what's more, I mean, in a nutshell, the reason I think that the Princess Bride book is not as good as the movie is that I think the book itself wanted to be a screenplay instead of a book. When he was writing the book, I think he really wanted to be writing a screenplay, and it's one of the things that the screenplayishness are some of the things that make it less successful as a book, So
wouldn't it be fun if we could have that conversation with him?
Yeah, it would be. Anyway, so that's but anyway, the point is it's just an example of how you could have an adaptation that does, in a sense, miss the core of the original, and yet succeed perfectly well, maybe even better. But yeah, even this idea of the core, it goes back to, I think, it informs the question about Star Warsiness for Visions, right? If I had to, choose among, there were some of the, when I, watching them all, there were some which, stylistically, I was like, whoa, this is really different from what I normally watch, which was interesting. But I'm like, I'm having a hard time getting into this because it's so strange visually or even audibly. But anyway, there were certainly some that I found extremely striking and really fascinating that I wasn't sure about at the beginning. Have you watched season 2 yet?
I have, yeah. I'm going to pull up
the first one. I think it's called The Sith. The very first episode of season 2. It's the one with all the colors. The painter and the Sith, the woman who's a painter, and the Sith comes after her and she fights him. Really, really striking visual display on that. Oh my goodness, yeah. At the very beginning, I was like, I'm not sure about this, and then I was just progressively blown away through the course of that short. But anyway, I had
to read back over that and how they use the paint as the actual medium to show character change, right? Because by the end, it starts as one very sparse, simple thing, and by the end, it is completely saturated and powerful. Yeah. The way in which the paint was both
literally involved in the plot and also being used as a visual metaphor, and it kept, there were times when it was hard to tell which was which, and anyway, it was very interesting. I mean, the way that it kind of played with the way in which color is used in Star Wars, even just like lightsaber color, right?
Yeah, I mean, when you see red, blue, green, yellow, you make certain associations. So having that be questioned was really interesting.
Yeah. And now, and then of course, light and darkness as well, with light side and dark side, also was a major kind of motif through that through that short. So yeah, no, it was yes, Phil, exactly. There was diegetic and non-diegetic paint in that episode. Yes. Absolutely. And yes, there were times when I wasn't sure which was which. When it was not clear. But anyway, so as I say, these questions about like in what ways are these stories which are not connected to like that story is actually a really good example where there is a Sith there, but story-wise, narrative-wise, there is no connection with anything else. Like this, the woman who is the protagonist of the short has no place in the story anywhere else, nor any reason to think she ever will be. The other person who came, the Sith who came to fight her was not anyone recognizable. So it was really just like the fact that there was a Sith there, right? And there were lightsabers used. You could say that was the only Star Wars-y thing about it, but it wasn't. There were also other superficial elements. There were droids, and there was a speeder, and and there was flying. I said pilots were another thing that seemed to me important.
And there was a few familiar sounds too, weren't there? They used some of the beeps and things like that.
Yep. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I felt that it was a very important, the whole, would she join the Sith, the kind of the moral and personal progress and dilemma of the protagonist. I was like, this is very core Star Wars. Yeah. Like this is part of the core.
But what I also liked was that it didn't require that knowledge. It hit, we all felt that, but for a big break between seasons 1 and 2, and then to have that as the first episode of season 2, that was a pretty smart choice, right? Because that acts as a really good gateway. You don't have to know everything that came before. You don't have to understand all of the references. We're just going to show you this really beautiful, interesting thing, and make sure that we reference something that will be familiar to you, so you know that it does tie into this world. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, most of, if I were looking at coming at Star Wars visions and coming at it from the opposite direction, that is, instead of looking at individual visions, shorts, and saying, does this succeed in being Star Wars-y enough? Do I feel like I'm in the Star Wars space, when I'm watching this? Instead of that, to look at the question, I found myself looking at the question from the other direction. I'm like, okay, taking all, 16 or something from the first 2 seasons. I think it was 8 in each, 8 shorts in each season. So. Taking all 16 short films together and saying, okay, based on these 16 short films, what do these filmmakers identify as the core of Star Wars?
Right. And we know they had guidance from the executive committee, and they had, working with the people that really helped define what that core is. Yeah. But they got to discover it themselves.
Yeah. And I would say my answer, which then I went back to kind of check against, all the other mainstream Star Wars things, right? And I think it's kind of right. I think that the core of Star Wars is the light and dark side of the Force, and the sort of the tension and the process of like self-actualization in the context of that, like the core narrative of the first trilogy, like the original Star Wars trilogy, is not, are the rebels going to overcome the Empire? It's, is Luke going to turn to the dark side or not? Right. The sort of tug of war between Luke and Vader, with Vader on the one hand as someone who has turned in the past and who does turn back at the end, and with the whole climax, the entire point of everything in the end was to tempt Luke to turn, right, in the end. And again, not saying that nothing else matters, but like that's the core story of the original Star Wars trilogy. And that seems to be the
good and evil.
Yeah. And finding the path there, and it's they're doing a really interesting thing where on the one hand they've created what seems at first like a very simplistic binary between, you know, the blue lightsaber and the red lightsaber, right? Between the light side and the dark side. But it's not just simplistic and binary. And you can see the sort of, you know, the attraction and the pull along the way in either direction. And that seemed to be, there was a significant number of the stories that really kind of touched on that idea. Not all of them involved Jedis. Not all of them involved lightsabers. Many of them did. I mean, that was a major trend. The majority of the stories were like one Jedi in the midst of non-Jedi, you know, somebody who turns out to be a Jedi or to have abilities to be trained as a Jedi or something like that. That was a very frequent kind of trend.
That's a pretty exciting question to ask of this, though. Like, we keep talking about core. Does it have to be the same for each person? I mean, everything we're kind of describing just makes me think about individual choices and relationships, right? So maybe that's our core, but not everybody tells it in the same way. So maybe there's a couple of cores that can work, so long as they all are honoring.
Yeah, and it's not to say that, you know, any story must or should be reducible to like a really simplistic, you know, or one single or simplistic thing.
No, cores can be really complicated. Don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think, and there are certainly different people can place different sort of priorities on different things, right? So yes, I do think it's not to say, I'm not trying to claim that there's like one single sort of simple thing there. But at the same time, it is clear that you can objectively miss it.
Yes.
Right. I mean, like the cancer survivor story, fundamentally different story, not the same story. Right.
Doesn't mean they might not have told a good story. Wrong story. Different story.
Just not that story. It would be a falsely identified story. Right.
Yeah. So what about the complications when we don't have a singular core? I'm thinking Rings of Power now. So how do we define that? We know there were a lot of cooks in that kitchen, a lot of opinions coming into that. We don't know if they fit the mark yet or not. We're only a fifth of the way through it, so it's a little safer to talk about, I think. But
yeah.
Sorry, throwing you a curveball. I'm like, this one's making me think.
You know, what I'm trying to think is like, okay, what would I identify as the core of the Lord of the Rings? I think I've asked this question before. I don't know that I've
talked about this before.
I think we have. I'm trying to think if I've answered it.
You and me.
But it's okay. I can't remember what my answer was, so that means will just be a fascinating other data point. I
have in my head what I think you're going to say, so I want you to finish, and then I'm going to tell you what I was thinking.
I think the core is similar to the core that I was describing for Star Wars, basically. I think that the core is... Madagat, I think that eucatastrophe is important. But yes, Phil, I'm going more in that direction, that the small hands theme and the importance of individual choices. Yeah, Amdir Estel is a really, really important theme, but I don't think it's ultimately the core, the different forms of hope. Like, hope is important. And of course, Maggie, you'll remember, hope is one of the things that the showrunners identified as being a core.
Hope and friendship are the two.
It's got to be a story of hope, or it's not a Tolkien story.
Tolkien story.
But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I do think that the the choices that are made by individuals, Frodo taking the ring to Mordor, Sam sticking with Frodo on the way to Mordor, Gandalf, Aragorn, Pippin. I mean, the choice of, you know, Gandalf's famous line about, you know, the only thing that we have to decide is what to do with the time that's given to us, right? That kind of idea is, I think, what is really at the core. And this is why I never agreed with people who said that they thought that the Rings of Power had deviated from the core. And I'm like, what, in what way? Like, are we seriously going to say that we think that white people are the core?
Yeah,
like,
right.
Honestly, is that the problem here?
What's your definition of core?
Like, I don't, and I know that seems a very slighting way. People will talk about the mythology for England as if that's all about white people and stuff. And I fundamentally disagree with all of those arguments. But even if, and I'm speaking highly theoretically here, even if I were to grant, which I do not, that English mythology equals white people, and that is the heart of what Tolkien was trying to do, you know, even indirectly, because what he was trying to do was English mythology, and that's a mythology for white people. And so, you know, the kind of Black Panther parallels people kept making and everything, right? Even if I grant all that, which I do not grant, but even if I did grant all that, I would still say it's not the core. It's just, I don't at all think that that's the case. And what's more, I would defy anyone. No, I don't even have to defy anyone. Look back at the decades and decades of Tolkien response and reaction prior to the release of the Rings of Power, and tell me that anyone has always seen, you know, the culture of white people and the mythology of England to be at the core of the Lord of the Rings. I mean, again, that Tolkien talked about this, we all knew that there were interesting implications of it. Many saw, but there has never, ever, prior to the Rings of Power, to the reactions against the Rings of Power, ever been this wellspring of, you know, allegiance to the idea that, like, white people are somehow essential to Tolkien's vision.
Well, and it's so limited in terms of telling the story. I mean, how many stories do we have that are like Romeo and Juliet, but with mice? You know, like.
Yep.
But I just.
Yep.
It's not about the cast. It's not about the cast. We're talking
well,
story.
And that's exactly the question, right? When it comes to the racial question in the Rings of Power. Or the question of the more recent thing with Black Aragorn on the Magic the Gathering cards, the Lord of the Rings Magic the Gathering cards. The point is not even to say, like, the irrelevant. It's irrelevant whether or not that is. The point does that person they drew on that card look like Tolkien imagined Aragorn? That's not the question at all, right? The question it's just like the Romeo and Juliet question that you were asking, right? And think about, what is it? Why do those? What makes an adaptation, that kind of an adaptation, that kind of a modulation adaptation, right? That third category that, you know, when I was categorizing adaptations before, what makes that successful? When you've identified that core, right? When you're capturing something about the Romeo and Juliet story, even though it's miles and miles away from, what was it, Verona? I think that was in Verona where we make our stand. I'm trying to remember the opening lines of the chorus. Yeah. Anyway, Italy. Like, it's way far away from Italy, right?
In fair Verona, we lay our scene.
Yeah. Fair Verona. That was what I thought. Okay. Anyway, but like the same thing. So, like, or Clueless, right, or something like that. Like, Clueless is a great adaptation. Yes, exactly, because it captures something
Yes.
about the original. Like it's still, it's recognizably wrestling with the same stuff. And Tolkien adaptation, a lot of Tolkien fans aren't ready for this, but I think we're just talking about this at Mythmoot actually. I was floating my idea of like a Western, an American West set Tolkien story.
I'm like, you had me at Western. Yes, whatever is
Oh yeah.
following. Yes.
No, I would, when like to take the like the Ranger idea. I'm thinking like Eriador and the Wild West. Like you take Tolkien's idea of the wild and kind of juxtapose it with the Wild West, and there's anyway. It could be fascinating. It'd be a fascinating way to explore some of these things.
And there's so many stories about like taking this thing and moving it into space, taking this thing and putting it in the bottom of the sea, like taking this thing and making it animated mushrooms, like whatever. That isn't the point. The point is the story you're telling and how you're telling.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's really about what is the essence, right? What is the
Madagog here too, the battle seems to be a problem because of your expectation, because you're picturing what we've already seen and what we know. The issue with a battle, the problem we have to show is two sides. We can show two sides in many different ways. So it just depends how that story is told on screen. It might just be two people. It might be, coaches versus a train. I don't know. Like we figure out.
Yeah, I mean, the shootout at the OK Corral didn't actually involve that many people, right?
Right.
But it can be an epic and climactic battle, right?
Yeah, and I assume you were Madagog, but that was a good example of like, yeah, we have these expectations because of what we've seen and what our experience is. And also filmmakers need to be aware of that. So everybody's bringing all that into the room when they go to watch some of these things. So if you're going to challenge that, if you're going to give them something different, that's fine, as long as you don't muck up the core. Like you can still challenge that while having the essence of the story be really strong and very clear.
Yeah, no, I think it would be, there are lots of interesting possibilities there. And in some ways, this kind of adaptation is almost, I don't know, I'm tempted to say it's really a kind of higher level adaptation, because really, like, you're really finding the core. When you're doing that, when you're kind of cutting the tether between your own imagination as far as the characters and the story and everything, you're not trying to do, like, I'm still clueless in my head right here. You're not thinking about like fitting out a barouche. You're not thinking about gowns. You're not thinking about trying to represent like what Hartfield should look like compared to what like where the Fairfax is, whatever. I mean, like, you're not thinking about that, right? Instead, you're Hartfield. I'm thinking of thinking of Emma. Anyway, point is, you're not thinking about that stuff, right? You kind of cut the tether from all of those things, and now you're just instead saying, what is the core of the story, right? What is the drama that matters? What are the characters that matter? What are the character interactions that matter? And whether you might do, I mean, Clueless does a pretty intricate character by character parallel, right? Yeah. It's not perfect. They make some alterations, but it's pretty close, right? The way they've preserved almost all of the major characters from Emma, and given them a direct parallel in this new world is very intricate and very close. But you don't even have to do that. Like, they went further in that direction than they had to do in order to still preserve the core of the story. Just like you don't need all of the characters of Romeo and Juliet, right, in order to do a Romeo and Juliet story. West Side Story is a good example of that. But anyway, it's in some ways I would love, I hope I live to see Tolkien adaptations of this kind. I really do. Because I think it's not really until you start going there that you're really, really challenged to think about the core.
Yeah.
Because it's very possible. I felt that there was a great deal of the Peter Jackson trilogy that missed the core of Tolkien. But they did such a good job with so many of the other things, right? Anyway, but
they still tell a wonderful story.
Yeah. I mean, and their story is a very good story, and there are many similarities to what Tolkien is doing.
But you can see the pitfalls that if you miss the core and you're not telling a good story, you don't stand a chance.
No.
If you miss the core and you tell a really good story, you're going to piss off fans, but you might still have a dedicated audience that loves your film. So you might be able to break even and stuff. But why would you risk that first one when you could just put in the more time and investment and work and try to get to the core?
Yeah.
Figure out what that is.
Though again, like, there's also go back to Harry Potter for a second, right? Part of the success of the first Harry Potter film is going to be premised not on story, not even essentially on the core of the story, but like, am I going to feel like I'm at Hogwarts?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
and what does that feel like?
Is it going to look like Hogwarts? Is it going to feel like Hogwarts? Right? Getting the setting right, getting the what I am tempted to call the superficial elements of the story. And they're not superficial, they're deeply important. But again, like, this is where I think it is possible to have an adaptation where you're like, man, the scenery, the costuming, they're doing it really, really well, right? But sorry, actually, I think several Jane Austen adaptations are this way.
I was thinking about Robin Hood as you were talking.
Interesting.
Was it? Yeah, the more recent one. Can't remember. But I remember the setting, the costume, the design, the sound, amazing. Story,
right?
You know, you can tick a lot of boxes. You miss a few bits.
Yeah, and are they really getting the core of the Robin Hood story? I'm not sure that they were exactly.
Right.
But yeah. No, but yeah. So sometimes that superficial stuff can be almost a distraction, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. If they get that part wrong, then I'm already worried because, you know, again, I think I've done this example with Twilight before, where like they had to get a black leather sofa in Edward Cullen's bedroom because originally in the script it said they sat down on Edward's bed. And somebody was like, he doesn't sleep. He doesn't have a bed. If you have a bed in there, everybody's going to be pissed off because you don't understand that Edward doesn't sleep and he needs to have a black leather sofa. Like, it does not matter, but it matters so much. If I'm distracted and care about a bed not being there, I'm going to be pissed off for the rest of the film and not pay attention to you.
But I think the distraction can go the other way as well. So I'm thinking about Emma. The recent Emma adaptation, it was on Prime Video. I forget who did it.
It was BBC, I think.
Yeah, it might have been the BBC. It was gorgeous. It was like incredibly gorgeous. Like,
I'm blanking on her name, the woman from Queen's Gambit.
Yeah,
that actress. It was beautiful.
Incredibly beautiful.
Yeah,
the costuming, the landscape, the colors was just unbelievable. And I spent a whole lot of the time I was watching just in awe of what they had put together visually. But it wasn't a great adaptation of the book. Like, the characters in the core, I don't think they did a great job with the core of that book in that adaptation. Like, I didn't love it. I wanted to love it because I was admiring it so much. But I think, had the visuals been less good, had I been less distracted by how gorgeous everything was, I would have been even more aware of I would have been much more annoyed about the fact that I felt like they were just like, I felt like the Gwyneth Paltrow Emma adaptation didn't really get Emma's character at all. I mean, with Jane Austen, it so much has to, like, do you really get the heroine? Like, the core of the heroine's character and what makes that heroine important and what her story is. And I felt that Gwyneth Paltrow did not. I'm not blaming Gwyneth Paltrow herself, but the Gwyneth Paltrow version, I felt like, did not really get the Emma character right. Madagat points out that I think we saw this with the elven hair thing and the feminine dwarf beard thing for the Rings of Power.
Getting hung up on these details that don't really affect it. But if that's what we're going to focus on and you don't get that right, you don't stand a chance for the core being recognized.
Yeah. And that's an example of that's one example of, I think, if I had to say mistakes that I think that the showrunners made with season 1, I think that they presumed on more goodwill than they got.
That's fair.
I think that they were assuming that people would be willing to roll with a little bit more. I mean, and I'm not even talking about more changes. I mean, elves having short hair, this is not a major canonical issue at all. I mean, people can try to construct cases, but the lengths you have to go to try to bring any textual evidence to the question of elf hair is yeah, exactly is a testimony to the fact that this is not a crucial issue in Tolkien's writings. Like, it's just not. It is not, for instance, a question that would be parallel to what happens to vampires in the sunlight in Twilight, right? That's a little more prominent, right? And so therefore, whereas again, it's totally fringe, but again, certainly distracting from. But again, the extent to which people were ready to get up in arms about female dwarf beards or about elf hair length. Again, is a sign that they were not willing to show goodwill. And honestly, the whole time I was listening to that, I felt from the beginning that I was like, well, if it's not this, it would be something else. Like this, what you're telling me is not, I care deeply, deeply, deeply about how long elf hair is. What you're telling me is, I am not willing to like this.
I'm not open.
Yeah, I'm not open to this at all. Yeah.
And I really want to pick a fight.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and if it's not this, it'd be something else.
And there's different ways you can kind of approach that too. Like, I almost feel sorry for those people because they're not giving themselves the opportunity to engage with this. But also, it's probably coming from a place of anxiety and worry and protectiveness for a work that they like. So, you know, there's just a certain space that they're not willing to open up to because they're scared that their own ownership of the piece is going to be threatened in some way. Right. So going into an adaptation, you almost have to shelve that and just say, doesn't affect anything about how I engage with this story. I'm just going to engage with this story and see what happens.
Right. Yep. So, but yes, so it's interesting. One of the things we're kind of coming around to here in some ways is that there are ways in which identifying the core, getting the core right, isn't in fact the only thing, right? Isn't all that matters, in fact. It's interesting.
Good luck to those people. Have an open mind. See if you can find some enjoyment.
So speaking of having an open mind, let me come back to Indiana Jones, because I admit my mind is not open. Like, I've been scarred. You didn't seem very
open.
I wasn't open. I wasn't open. Now, I love the Indiana Jones movies, you know. But yeah, like, I pretended that nothing exists since the
trilogy,
the Holy Grail film. Yes, I have. Like, The Last Crusade is, you know, I've tried to pretend nothing exists after that. Am I right? As Phil says, all three of them. No, that's exactly it. So I'm trying to be open about the fifth one, I guess.
And if you watch the trailers, I think that's what they're hoping the audience is going to go into, because they have to know everybody was burned by the skull.
Yeah.
So a lot of time passed, a lot of, you know, mistakes were made and things discussed. They seem to be leaning so hard into the nostalgia for this trailer.
Yeah.
That I don't think it's going to be an epic story of any kind. They're just going to let us all have a good time.
Yeah.
That's my hope going into it. The bar is pretty low.
It is.
But I expect to have a fun time.
But this is a side note, but I would like to come back to the question. I think I need to. The hardest part about having this discussion is I think I'd have to watch The Crystal Skull again, but but I would like to have a better grasp on exactly where and how that's a failure. Is it simply that they told a bad story? Because I don't think it's that. I don't think it's maybe it is. Maybe it's simply that was a really bad story for all of these ways. It's a bad story that happened to be an Indiana Jones film. But I think there's more. I think there's an element of like the core of Indiana Jones that they left behind.
I think there's a lot there, and I think the definition of bad story is really tough, because if you're just saying a bad story, yeah, there's some plot holes, there's some poorly developed characters, there's some really schmaltzy, cheesy, gimmicky moments that you're just like rolling your eyes at, but also bad story with relationship horror and, you know, the impact that the Holy Grail had on us and the hurt that was in the end of that story and the father-son relationship. And I know they tried with Shia LaBeouf, but it just didn't play anything close to what Sean Connery and Harrison Ford had. So it tried to tap into that, didn't it? But it didn't do a very good job. And like you said, I'd probably have to rewatch it again, but I feel like we'd have to have a drink or two and do a live watch party for that to be an enjoyable
we might need some serious support there.
And is that the one you want us to do? I mean, come on, we can surely find a better.
Right. I mean, if we're getting together with refreshments and a live party, do we really want to be dragging ourselves through the Crystal Skull again?
I feel like we should make a poll for that to happen, because that sounds really fun.
But I do think it would be an interesting question. Like, to answer the question, you know, the way that C.S. Lewis talked about this, which was so informative to me and so informed my readings during the Hobbit films. Wherein does its badness consist? It's not just enough to say it's bad. Wherein exactly does its badness consist? And not just to be doing the crit fic thing. People often talk about the Crystal Skull and say, like, it was such a money grab, like they were just trying to exploit the popularity of Indiana Jones to make money. Of course they were. Every sequel ever made, like good sequels as well as bad, are all done for that reason. Like, movie making is a business. It's not a charity, right? So of course they were trying to make money, and of course they were trying to exploit the popularity of it to make money. Every sequel does that. That's not an answer. Like, that doesn't make it bad. That is not the reason it is bad. So anyway,
and that reason can be different for different people, and it can be compounded by different things. You know, I'm happy to go into discussion one day about character and things like that, but the thing that keeps coming to the front of my mind is the damn ants, because they were so badly CGI. Like, if I get hung up on a technical thing, like we said with the other plot story elements, it's a shame that will be the downfall. But that was my downfall, because I was too distracted by this bad thing. I couldn't even pay attention to the other stuff.
Yeah. Hey, let's start a whole series of discussing bad adaptations.
Analytically, not crit fic.
Yeah. Let's do this. Fun. Let's talk about bad examples, because I also want to see like what good things we can learn. And not just learn in the sense of don't do that, but learn. Like I've often said that even a bad adaptation helps you understand things about the original 100%. That you didn't before. Even some of the things, not just because there are some redeeming features to every bad thing, but even the things that they do badly often do. But and all the references, you know, we give in this show of like, well, this is what they could have done, but let me tell you about, and you start listening. Right. It's so helpful. Yeah. So it would be fun to think of several examples of bad adaptations.
That's a good name.
Yep,
I feel like that could be in partnership with fan tracks.
Well, I'm actually kind of thinking that. I'm like, we could do a fan track recording actually of the Crystal Skull and talk about that. Yeah. It would be a fun doing some films in which we're just simply talking about it as adaptation, you know, both good and bad, would be really interesting.
Yeah. Not those minds and hands.
Right. Exactly. Different minds and hands, please. Yeah.
All right. We will work on another minds and hands watch along. I think that's a good move for the summer.
And that'd be fun.
and we'll build up some. I feel like we must have mentioned fan tracks in here, but that's a project in development with the studio. So hopefully by the end of the summer, you guys will have access to that. But it's audio tracks that you can hit play and watch your favorite or least favorite movies, and have us talking analysis alongside, and not just us. You know, everybody in our Signum community and creators and whatnot. But,
yeah.
cool.
Awesome. All right. Well, we have to run as always. Thanks everybody for a really fun discussion. But looking forward to more. Yeah, bad adaptations. I totally want to talk about
bad adaptations, not those minds and hands. That's great.
Yeah, awesome.
Love it.
Anyway, thanks everybody. We'll be back for more conversations soon, especially this summer with Maggie here. We may be doing all kinds of different things. So, should be fun stuff coming up. So awesome. Thanks everybody. Bye now.
See ya.